Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Well, thank you for coming, and welcome to the session on research issues in internet governance. I'm very pleased to be here, joined by our panelists, distinguished panel of speakers. So just to kind of get an idea of the room, how many of you are familiar with issues in internet governance? And, okay. Great, perfect, because usually when I ask that question, I get, sort of this blurry view, and people say, like, what is that? Their eyes, freeze over. So what I'd like to do, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is to address three things in my opening remarks. Just give you a formal definition for internet governance, which I'll shorten to say, what is IG? Give an overview of the process, because unfortunately, it's very difficult to have a conversation about the substance of the IG issues without understanding the process that's ongoing in the US and globally. And then also then dive into the substance, and then that's where I'll leave for our distinguished panelists to help frame some of the issues. So IG defined. As the internet becomes the underlying foundation for the digital economy, and its impact starts to be felt both culturally, socially, and economically, increasingly regulators across the world start to scrutinize who's actually managing this infrastructure. That, in addition to an additional set of issues which include the unique role of the US government, that the internet operates without centralized control, without heeding geopolitical boundaries, that information and services can be accessed by anyone on any devices without formal governmental control. These factors combined further challenges the traditionals of national sovereignty and also exacerbate the existing tension that's already there because of the impact of the internet. And these issues, including others such as Snowden, form the pressure points for the ongoing public policy dialogue on internet governance. So that's the environment in which these discussions are taking place. So a formal definition of internet governance is the development and application by governments, the private sector, and civil society in their respective roles of shared principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures, and programs that shape the evolution and use of the internet. Inherent within that discussion, for those of you who aren't familiar with the conversation, is the involvement of multi-stakeholders beyond the government. So it includes civil society, the technical and academic community who had been involved in this conversation, people like yourself who've been involved in the formation of the internet since the beginning, and also business. However, the central debate in IG issues is whether such a federated, multi-stakeholder approach is a more appropriate model for developing the impacted policies than what would be termed a more intergovernmental model, like the UN model, where governments sit down and negotiate treaties on how to run and how to control various issues on the internet. I'll come back to that a little bit more. So how did these issues get started? It started all, roughly about in the late 90s, when commercial use of the internet started to take off, and the world starts to recognize sort of the impact of the evolution of ICT on economic development. Everyone started to pay attention to these issues. There were two parallel but interrelated developments. In the US government, under the auspices of the National Telecommunications Administration, or NTIA for short, in the Department of Commerce, started an effort to privatize the management and operations of the internet. This includes things such as management of the IP addresses, the protocol numbers, and also things like root zone name servers, management of some of the administration of some of the contents for some of the domain. The Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, or ICANN for short, was incorporated as a nonprofit corporation in California in 1988 in response to this request. And ICANN then entered into contract with NTIA to assume the IANA functions. From this simple start, ICANN has grown into a large organization with sophisticated and processes that would involve multiple stakeholders in its policy development processes. Participants from the technical and academic community, civil society, business, and governments are involved in the policy development process on equal footing. In 2014, NTIA announced its decision to terminate the contract when it expires on September 30th of this year, 2015, and that ICANN needs to convene a multi-stakeholder process to transition the current role of NTIA to the global multi-stakeholder community. Thus began this whole process and discussion on the IANA transition, which is ongoing as we speak today. So that's what's happening in the US. Internationally, at the same time, in the late 90s, the UN took up the issue of what oversights are necessary to realize a global information society. These discussions culminated in the development of something called the Tunis Agenda at the World Summit on Information Society, WSIS for short. The Tunis Agenda is a seminal document that to this day lays out many of the issues in globalizing internet governance. It did 4 things, amongst others, but these are the ones I want to highlight for this conversation here. It recognized the role of multi-stakeholder approaches in policy development, but also that all governments should have equal footing. So again, that gets back to the role of the US government. It created something called the Internet Governance Forum, or the IGF, as a global multi-stakeholder forum for dialogues on IG public policy issues. So this is very much an environment where all the different stakeholders come in and discuss issues, but there's no policy making. Thirdly, it set up 11 action lines that the different UN agencies and all stakeholders can work together to build out and realize the information society, especially in developing countries. And lastly, it requested a review by the UN General Assembly of the progress in 10 years, and that's in December of this year. So in 2014, 2 events are happening which impact the internet governance discussions: the IANA transition and the WSIS plus 10 review. So that's the process and the environment against which these issues are being discussed. So what's the substance of the issues? Often, IG is considered a monolithic discussion, a single discussion with multi-stakeholderism as the best solution for all issues involved. In reality, and our speakers will really delve into this, the issues involved are much, much more nuanced and complex. There are many ways to frame the discussion, and we'll explore some of this throughout the session. However, at the highest level, you can look at 2 broad categories: the technical issues and technical governance of the internet for sustained stability, security, and resiliency of the infrastructure. And secondly, social political governance of internet use, including issues such as integrity of the information, privacy and security, child pornography, fraud, surveillance, etc. There are also macro issues, such as trust in the overall ecosystem, cross-border data flow, and appropriate sovereignty models for the digital world. Furthermore, what we have traditionally considered the internet is also changing. You heard from Jeanette this morning about all the technology innovations. The machine learning, transnational cloud, data analytics, consumer robotics, and social machines. Each of these further extend the impact of the internet in novel and unforeseen ways, creating additional complications. So therefore, it seems fitting that in this year we have a discussion to explore how internet governance can benefit from more comprehensive, nuanced, evidence-based dialogues, and engage more multidisciplinary academics, engage more of you into this conversation with the objective of contributing new rigor, expertise, and perspective on specific issues that in a way that would enable progress in the overall policy discussion. So that's really the intention and the objective of this discussion. That's why I'm thrilled that these panelists are able to join us here, each with a very different perspective on the issues and as well as practical experience in participating in these issues. I've asked our panelists to address two questions from their unique perspectives: how academic research can help enable more thoughtful, evidence-based dialogues in internet governance public policy discussions, and what are some of the issues that can benefit most from academic research and expertise. You all have the bios of the panelists, but I'd still like to introduce them briefly. Laura Donardis is a well-known eminent scholar of internet architecture and governance, a professor in the School of Communications at American University in Washington, D.C., an affiliated fellow of the Yale Law School Information Society, a senior fellow of the Center for International Governance Innovation, and a current research director for the Global Commission for Internet Governance. Laura has published multiple books and engaged globally in multiple policy discussions. Brendan Kurbis is a postdoctoral researcher at Syracuse University School of Information Studies, where he is currently researching governance structures in securing internet routing. Brendan is a regular contributor to policy discussions, but he has actively participated in ICANN in the INR transition process for multiple years now. Next, we have Stephanie Forrest, a Regents Distinguished Professor of Computer Science at the University of Mexico, a recent chair of the department and a member of the Santa Fe Institute external faculty. Stephanie is an expert with 20 years experience leading interdisciplinary research and education programs at UNM, but more interestingly, she spent a year at the US State Department working on cybersecurity and had direct input into some of the policy discussions. And Susan Aronson is a research professor at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs and a former Minerva Chair of National War College. Susan is the author of multiple books on digital trade and human rights and globalization. She's also involved in advising government and other policy stakeholders. As she looks at these issues, Susan is contemplating developing a new international affairs curricula on the internet. We're also thrilled to have Paul Mitchell, who will be a respondent. Paul is a senior director in Microsoft's regulatory affairs team, leading policy initiatives in telecom and internet governance. Paul has led Microsoft's involvement in various IG forums, including ICANN, the ITU, various UN agencies, and has engaged frequently with policy stakeholders globally on these issues. Laura, if I may ask you to start our panel, and also, in addition to the questions, if you can share your experience and how you have engaged with IC policy stakeholders globally, directly and indirectly, and what has been some of the outcomes. Thank you.
Certainly. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be at the Microsoft Faculty Summit. It's nice to be out of Washington today and in this beautiful part of the country, and thank you very much, Carolyn, for that nice introduction, for organizing the panel. Really, the first thing to be said is obvious to all of us in this room, but it's not necessarily obvious to policymakers, and that's that internet governance is not a discussion. It's actually a set of functions that involve the administration and the coordination of the technologies that are necessary to keep the internet operational, and then the enactment of substantive policy around those. So there's a lot to study. It's not just a process or content or a discussion. A second point is that, and picking up on what Carolyn said, although the internet is absolutely governed, it's not a monolithic system, as you said, but it's rather layer upon layer of functions. Some of them are carried out by the private sector. Some of them are carried out by traditional governments in international treaties. And some are carried out by this strange construct called multi-stakeholder governance. So it's very interesting to study. Of course, there is the administration of names and numbers by ICANN. There, I said my first acronym, my fault. I was trying to not say any acronyms. But since you used it, it's fair game. And the US has some oversight in that area. Brendan will talk about this quite a bit in his remarks. But there's also the establishment of technical protocols by institutions such as the Internet Engineering Task Force in the World Wide Web Consortium. There's an entire other area regarding access and interconnection coordination. Everyone here understands that the internet is not actually a cloud. It has buildings and fiber optic cable and satellites and Coke machines in the buildings where you can get a soda and people working at it. You know, there's a physical infrastructure, and there are private contractual arrangements and also government oversight in some cases of how that interconnection happens. And more obvious areas, cybersecurity governance, involving a combination of public and private sector institutions. And I would add to that the policy-making role of private companies, such as Google and other information intermediaries, which through their terms of service and through their institutional decisions make decisions about civil liberties, access to knowledge, privacy, what counts as free speech in the digital age, cyberbullying, and other kinds of important policy making roles. So it's a fascinating area because we have the technical mediation of the public sphere, but in some cases, the privatization of the conditions of civil liberties within that sphere. So I enjoy studying it very much. And as academics, I think breaking down the categories and not just calling it a monolithic enterprise is very helpful, because policymakers will ask the question, well, does it make sense for the internet to be governed by the United Nations, or the US government, or Microsoft, or a multi-stakeholder construct? So that question, let's just dismiss that, because it doesn't make any sense. The question really is, what is the proper form of governance in any particular area? Now, another point to make is that this stuff matters. There's really a lot at stake, and academic research really helps move the policy-making decision away from a framing such as it's just a technical decision and into the realm of that matters for innovation, for global economic policies and trade, and of course for civil liberties. And I can say that as an engineer, as well as a social scientist, that it really does matter. In fact, the thesis of my own work is that the arrangements of technical architecture are also arrangements of power. You see that in, just to give a few simple examples, where would we be without web accessibility standards for the disabled? How social media terms of service are defined makes enormous decisions about what can stay online and what is taken down, who can speak. We see things like access regulation, net neutrality rulings, making decisions that affect competition and innovation. And of course, the administration of names and numbers, domain names like Microsoft.com and their associated numbers, really a lot of trademark issues there, but also free speech. There was a proposal for a .gay TLD, a top-level domain, and some countries did not want to have, like Saudi Arabia said, we don't want to have .gay in the world. Very interesting and important free speech issues. So I just mentioned that because there are very real public policy issues here, and that's what academics study, is how it affects everyday people. Now, another task of researchers, of course, is to identify the problems. You could say that the internet governance ecosystem has worked very well. The internet is still operational. We continue to be able to send email and to check Reddit and upload things to Twitter and obsess, as I do, over all of these applications. We have 3 billion users. This will quickly grow to 5. It's scaling very well. Despite all of the data breaches that we hear about, the internet is relatively secure compared to what could happen. And every sector of the global economy depends on the internet to function. Things are fairly stable, but we can't take this for granted. So it's always important to say what could go wrong. So coming back to Carolyn's opening remarks, one thing that I would posit is that government involvement in some aspects of internet governance is creating profound problems. I'll mention just a few of them. So one destabilizing factor is the loss of trust in cyberspace. In a recent poll of 23,000 internet users in 24 different countries, we found that 2/3 of users were considerably more concerned about privacy than they were in the previous year. Now, some of this is because of the Snowden disclosures of NSA surveillance. Some of it is because of growing awareness of the private data that is collected and used to monetize the business models. We do everything online for free. And obviously the Faustian bargain is that data is collected about us and then monetized in online advertising. There's more awareness of that, also more awareness of the high-profile security breaches. So this combination of the government surveillance, private surveillance, and increasing human security complexities really has created a loss of trust. Another destabilizing factor is one that I study a lot, and that's the co-opting of internet technical infrastructure for things having absolutely nothing to do with keeping the internet operational. So it's being used for geopolitical means, most obviously when the Egyptian government cut off internet access using internet exchange points and other kinds of technical points of control, but also many other areas such as law enforcement and large media companies turning to the domain name system to enforce intellectual property rights, to cut off sites that have pirated material, to filter data and censor data in some parts of the world. So the domain name system really carries out a straightforward function of translating names into numbers, but it can be used as a mechanism for cutting off content. And when you think about the scale of this, that hundreds of billions of queries take place a day, and it's a system that's distributed over multiple servers. It's very complicated. It has technical complexities and implications. And I'll just mention one more. Brendan, you'll talk about the uncertainty over the IANA transition. That's a potentially destabilizing factor. We're going to go from US oversight to X, Y, or Z. What is that thing that we're going to? Just because things have gone well in the past doesn't mean that they will continue to do so. So how that transition occurs is very important. And of course, just finally, the attempts to overlay national borders on the global internet. We have increasing politically driven movements to localize data in countries. And a lot of this is a response to trying to have more private data. But let's say that Carolyn and I, it didn't work out for you at Microsoft, and I didn't want to be an academic anymore, and we wanted to start our own company. Let's say it was a social media company. How would we possibly do business in every single country that requires us to localize customer data there? We would have to set up server farms in every country. So this has implications not only for how rights get distributed in human security and human rights, but also our ability to innovate. So I think that these are very important issues. Having academics with a technical background coming from computer science, I know we have many computer scientists here at this event, is vitally important to bring it out of the realm of political science and into the realm of keeping the infrastructure operational and keeping a universal internet. So I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to discuss this. The internet is governed. There's not a single system. There are huge, profound policy implications. The system has worked fairly well, but we can't take that for granted. So policy-engaged scholarship that engages in these issues is important. And I would just suggest, as one closing thought, that the need to keep the internet operational and the governance around that in order to keep it operational really should count and rank as high as other kinds of global collective action problems, such as environmental rights, anti-terrorism, and other kinds of human rights. So it's vitally important, and I'm very happy that you invited me to speak about this today.
Thank you, Laura, for your comments and a very comprehensive exposition of the issues as well as the challenges, as well as certainly a lot of really interesting questions. I hope that many of you out there are starting to think about related research questions to answer some of Laura's challenges, because they are challenges. I think the other thing that Laura has pointed out is that these questions really require multidisciplinary conversations. They are cross disciplines, and they really do require the understanding of the impact. So Brendan, as you speak to address the questions, can you also please share with us your perspective from your participation in ICANN, because you've been in the trenches?
Sure.
And also your view on this process at work.
Sure. So thank you, Carolyn, for having me here to join my esteemed colleagues, and as well as all of you. I hope to get some dialogue with you and involve you in kind of this discussion about this elusive topic of internet governance. What is this IANA transition all about, and why is it of interest to academics? So Carolyn covered a little bit of ICANN's history, created in 1998, and it was an organization that was quote-unquote purpose-built to maintain the registries for top-level domain names, TLDs, Internet Protocol address blocks, and also various protocol parameters, more than 1,000 registries. And together, these are the IANA functions. The intent was always to transfer the governance of the IANA functions to the private sector, but the US government maintained its oversight role for over the last 17 years. Now, the USG has, at times, that oversight role has been controversial as it's inserted itself into the policy process. Probably the most notable case is the .XXX case from several years ago. But really, oversight holds more of a symbolic importance in that it places a single government's role above all others. And this symbolism became more pronounced with the Snowden revelations. And that spurred the Internet's organic governing organization, so ICANN, the regional Internet registries, and the Internet Engineering Task Force, to call for ICANN's independence. And it also fostered dialogues with other governments about how to do Internet governance and how to govern it. So an example of that would be the Net Mundial conferences that have gone on. Now, these developments would culminate in the March 2014 announcement by the NTIA to transition the governance of ICANN to the multi-stakeholder multi-stakeholder community, excuse me. And technically, the transition simply means that the US government will no longer have an authorization role in the maintenance of those registries. But more importantly, what it does is it removes the US government's ability and to use the IANA functions contract that it has with ICANN as a sword of Damocles. The contract creates real power to keep ICANN in compliance with broader USG objectives, and such as those that are detailed in the Joint Project Agreement during the Bush administration, or more recently in the affirmation of commitments that ICANN has with Department of Commerce. So, from a social scientist perspective, the IANA transition is definitely, it's a crucible for kind of exploring policymaking, from things like institution building and economic regulation of critical internet resources, to interest group, or AKA stakeholder interest group politics, and larger geopolitical issues about the role of government vis-a-vis other stakeholders and the role of multi-stakeholder versus multilateral governance. So at the request of the DOC, ICANN was asked to convene a process for developing the transition proposal. And the respective names, numbers, and protocol communities all argued to develop their own individual proposals and then coordinate those proposals to submit them to the Department of Commerce. Now, the numbers in protocol communities developed their proposals actually quite rapidly. It was more of, for them, it was more an exercise of clarifying their already existing contractual relationships that they had with the IANA functions operator, that is ICANN currently today. But the proposal for the names community would take much more time, and it would be much more difficult. A cross-community working group, of which I'm a participant in, as are several other academics and civil society actors, as well as the business side, and actually a few government participants. So while ICANN was formed to perform the IANA functions, in reality, it spends about 96% of its budget doing policy development activities for TLDs and developing the contractual arrangements amongst registries and registrars and the affected stakeholders. And so given this, the question was, well, how do you ensure stable, non-discriminatory access to the IANA registries and maintenance of the registries? And we had two camps forming. One was an internal camp, and this was a camp that proposed giving the IANA to ICANN indefinitely, and one was an external camp. and that was a proposal to essentially replace the NTIA with a new contracting authority. And eventually, the group could not settle on either one of these models. Eventually, the group moved towards a hybrid solution, which proposed functional separation, placing the IANA into an affiliate with which ICANN would actually have a contract, so much like the arrangements that the numbers in the protocol communities would have. And this proposal, the origins of it, I was a co-author on it along with someone from Center of Democracy and Technology, Matthew Shears, and a longtime ICANN participant, Aubrey Doria. So the arrangement would ensure the separation of ICANN's policy development from the IANA functions implementation. And this post-transition IANA would be subject to a stakeholder-run periodic IANA review function. And the proposal was actually recently approved by the chartering organizations of the working group. This just happened down in Buenos Aires a couple weeks ago at the ICANN meeting. But this left one big question. How do you ensure, so if ICANN has a contract with the PTI, how do you ensure that that ICANN and the ICANN board is held accountable to the global multi-stakeholder community? And that was a separate discussion, and it's ongoing. So this conversation was very much about determining kind of the necessary corporate governance mechanisms that ICANN needed in order to be released from the DOC contract. And what they came up with so far are some pretty substantial reforms. One being a reform to ICANN's mission statement and basically precluding ICANN from regulating services and content that are reliant on the DNS. So that's a big one. The second reform would be to the independent review process of board decisions and making those decisions actually binding, which is another big step in the right direction in terms of accountability reforms. And then the final was to plan to provide membership powers to ICANN supporting organizations and their advisory committees. And this would include board removal, strategic plan and budget approval by the community, as well as enforcement of the IANA functions review decisions. So the reaction to that, and particularly the membership proposal, has been somewhat mixed. The community strongly supports it. The NTIA, as well as some ICANN board members, have pushed back on this notion of creating hard forms of accountability, particularly membership. I'll just give you a little quote from Assistant Secretary Strickling from down in Buenos Aires. He said, he asked the community, why does it go through cycle after cycle of putting its own people on the board and then stops trusting them to act in the interest of the multi-stakeholder model? Now, as a scholar, this highlights for me, kind of a defining feature of internet governance, and that's this tension between looser, more cooperative forms of governance versus more formal, institutionalized mechanisms. And we see this all over in different areas of internet governance, this tension and what to do about it. So arguably, going forward, ICANN is shifting towards more formal, institutionalized forms of accountability. And in some, these governance problems are of interest to lots of different academics, whether you're a political scientist, an institutional economist like myself, or a computer scientist who might be able to devise systems that allow us to run the IANA functions in a much more decentralized fashion. But there are lots of ways to contribute, and there's lots of ways to have impact.
Great. Thank you, Brendan,
Sure.
for sharing your experience and also the hundreds of hours that you spent developing these transition proposals and the accountability issues, and still hundreds of hours to come. Yeah. So Stephanie, if I may ask you to go next, and also in addition to addressing the questions, also address, sort of how your research background was able to influence development of the policy positions at the State Department, and also since you've been back into the academic world, how that's influenced some of your current work as well.
Okay, is the microphone working? I got the other kind of microphone. Well, thank you. I have to say it's quite an honor to be sitting up here with everyone who's been thinking about these issues for so long. And really the sum total of my experience was the 1 year that I spent working at the State Department as a science and technology advisor from August, I guess, of 2013 to August of 2014. And it was a great experience, and I learned a huge amount. But I will say, coming back to the computer science community, the most common question I get is a version of the one that Carolyn just asked, which is, did you make a difference? And it would be a tremendous act of hubris to say, yes, I, Stephanie, in 1 year in Washington, had a great impact on the federal government, this incredibly huge beast. So I'm going to try and say a few things, but I say it a little bit tongue-in-cheek because the government is indeed very large. And one of the first things that I came to appreciate when I went to Washington is the fact that work in government is completely different from the way we in engineering approach it. We tend to set up problems, and then, as they said in the last panel, define an objective function, and then we go to that objective function. And first of all, our government is a democracy, and so it's many of the mechanisms and procedures are about the process of government rather than getting to a particular outcome. And then just even the way that work gets done in the government, the best way I can describe it is it's stream-oriented computing, where there's this huge river of issues and documents and meetings and things rushing by, and every now and then you have time to reach out and grab one and do a little processing on it and then throw it back into the river. And so it's very hard to say exactly what kind of impact one has in that kind of model. But I did, and so so at the State Department, I was associated with 2 out of the 3 groups that are specifically charged with working on cyber issues. And I worked on many, many different things during the year, but one of the things I happened to work on was this IANA transition. And so I will talk about that since it's relevant to the earlier remarks. And again, this is just a little bit of insight into how government works on a daily basis. I was asked by one of my colleagues to attend a meeting, and because he couldn't go, and it turned out to be the first meeting of an interagency task force that was charged with planning and thinking about how a transition of these IANA functions from the U.S. government to something else, like how that could happen. And so because I went to that first meeting, I then became a member of this task force, and it seemed pretty interesting, so I just kept going. And we met regularly for several months before this transition was announced. And so you might say, so that was pretty interesting just to be in the room. What impact did I have? Well, I worked directly, and I think I shaped to some extent the language that eventually became part of the public release. And in particular, we spent a lot of time in this task force discussing what the criteria would be for a successful proposal. So the idea is that what was publicly announced was sort of a request or invitation to this multi-stakeholder community to come up with a proposal to the U.S. government for how the IANA functions could be transitioned and what they would be transitioned to. And so what we worked on a lot were what the criteria should be for a successful proposal. And I guess to put it in computer science terms, and this is reiterating something that was said earlier, one of the things I pushed for was what we would call separation of concerns. That is that the management of the kind of engineering operations of the IANA functions should be, to the extent possible, maximum extent possible, sort of firewalled and separated from the government policy making, who should get .Amazon, those kinds of discussions. And then the other thing that I think was important was that because I was at the State Department doesn't think of itself as a technical agency. And because I was there, and often I was one of just 2 or 3 people in the room who could understand in detail what these technical functions were, and because I was a member of this small State Department team, the State Department was able, I think, to bring a lot of balance to the discussion in government about how the transition should be managed. And I guess that became a little more evident after the public announcement. There were a lot of kind of early course corrections to what was happening right in the 6 weeks or so right after the announcement. And I think the State Department played an important role in that, and I think they were able to have a more active and focused voice because they had a pet computer scientist on their team. Okay, so I think I just got the flag for 5 minutes left. So I want to turn to the second question, which is, how did this affect my research? And I guess there's 3 things that I want to talk about. The first one, and this wasn't just from the IANA, it was really my entire year in government. There are many things that come up in policy discussions that people assert to be true. And so one example that might surprise you is that in nearly every strategy document I saw and every conversation that I went to that involved something about the ITU and regulating the internet, one of the first words that comes up is spam. Spam is a huge problem, so they say, and that is why we have to regulate the internet. That's oversimplifying greatly. But at some point, I kind of woke up and said, well, what do you mean that spam is a problem? You're telling me that everyone in Africa doesn't have a computer. The way they access the internet is through a little old-fashioned flip phone and some sort of minimal interface that Facebook provides. Why? What do you mean that spam is a problem? And so there are a lot of questions like this. We recently actually followed up on that and looked at data breaches, which is something in this country everybody believes is a growing problem. And when you actually look at the data, it turns out there's no statistical evidence that data breaches are becoming more common or bigger. And I think there's a lot of, I just got the wrap-up sign. Anyway, a lot of sort of widely held beliefs that are not backed up by rigorous data or other kinds of evidence. And so that's something I think we can contribute to in research, and I've been looking at a bit myself. The other 2 things are my year reinforced my interest in what I call large-scale security questions, cybersecurity questions. That is, what kinds of interventions actually would make a difference in how secure our systems are, not like which ones will get accepted into a top-tier conference and which ones are the most rewarding technically, but what kinds of interventions will actually make a difference, where should they be deployed, and how should they be deployed? So that's a question that I'm very interested in, that I think requires a level of modeling that the computer and simulation that the computer security community generally hasn't been interested in. And then finally, also on the cybersecurity front, it was the people who do higher level thinking about cybersecurity than what I was acquainted with, over and over and over again say attribution is the problem. How do we attribute an attack, even if we can trace it back to a particular IP address? How do we decide who we can hold responsible for launching that attack? And so that's a question that I'm actively working on now, kind of trying to put it in a strategic game theory context. stay tuned. We have a model, and someday soon we might have some results. So it was a great year, and I think computer scientists should take more interest in going into these other agencies like the State Department, and you can make a difference.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie, for giving us sort of the inside view on the formation of the request for the IANA transition, and also for your advice on how researchers can really question the formation of some of these policy initiatives, but as well how policy can be injected into advanced cybersecurity research as well. Susan, if I may ask you to address your comments, but also as you interact with policy stakeholders around the world, what are some of your observations with respect to the need to educating these policy stakeholders as well?
Thank you so much. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. I'd like to make 4 points of areas of research that I think scholars should be looking at. It's not turned on. It's not.
You can use this if you want.
Thanks. Is this turned on? Yeah. Can you hear me now? Thank you.
Into it.
What a cliche. Okay, so, and I grew up in an academic family, so I learned from, age 2, let's say, that scholarship should be useful. So that's kind of my focus here. The first thing, in Washington, one of the things that strikes me is that there is no policy person responsible for ensuring that the policies that we make that govern the internet, whether it's domestic or international, do not undermine the internet and its long associated norms of openness, interoperability, and multi-stakeholderism. And maybe you don't agree that those are the norms, and that's something to discuss, but I do find it odd, and perhaps scholars should look to see if we need someone or someones to examine specific policies and how they may affect the functioning of the one global internet. Secondly, the demographics of the internet are changing dramatically. The user base is moving away from Western countries, such as the United States and EU and Latin America, towards many developing countries in Asia, including China and Indonesia. And many of these countries, the governments and the citizens, don't share the US-EU, if you will, dominated the US-EU norms of openness, interoperability, and multi-stakeholderism. So what effect will that have on internet governance? It's, to me, a very important question. Third, I do trade and human rights, and I'm very interested in the relationship between digital trade, if you believe that cross-border information flows are traded, and human rights. And I can tell you that neither area has good data. And without data, I think it's unlikely that I can convince you of any research question that I've done enough research. So for example, data itself is both an input and an output, right? The United States likes to label itself the data-driven economy, the knowledge-intensive economy. But we have very little data on data as an input or as an output. And so I urge scholars to start coming up with data on data. Okay, and then finally, I think there is a trend going on away from multi-stakeholderism where governments and engineers and businesses and average citizens who care about the internet can interact towards government-dominated venues of internet governance, such as trade agreements, such as the UN. And if my hypothesis is correct, scholars need to examine what that means for those norms that I mentioned before of openness, interoperability, and multi-stakeholderism. So those are 4 of the issues that I think academics should start looking at, and it would be great if such research could be interdisciplinary. Carolyn asked me to address one other question, and I will be very brief in that regard because I really want to hear your questions, as does everyone else on the panel. And that is, what should you and I learn about the internet and about internet governance? And it seems to me the internet is both a platform for and a subject of governance, and hence it should be a subject of civic education. You and I need to have more information and to influence the debates about how our data is used by governments and by companies. And so I think all academics should be involved in trying to educate not just their citizens, but the broader public about internet governance issues. Issues such as how are digital technologies changing the economy, society, business, and government? How are digital technologies changing notions of national sovereignty? How can digital technologies undermine and or facilitate economic growth and development? How are digital technologies affecting human rights? Are human rights the same online as they are offline if people behave differently online than they would offline? So those are some of the questions that I think we should address, and I look forward to hearing your questions, so I'll end it at that.
Great, thank you, Susan, for highlighting those issues for us, and in particular, the demographic change is a really, really interesting question, and its impact on how the internet evolves going forward. Paul? What I'd like to do at this point is to ask Paul to be a respondent to these comments, and also then set some of the context for further questioning. Janita.
Thank you. It's nice to see you all. Thanks very much for coming. It's interesting that my day this morning started out by watching a hearing featuring ICANN CEO Fadi Shahade and NTIA head Larry Strickling, or Assistant Secretary for Information and Communications Policy, and talking about all of these issues. And the most salient issue was how, in the conclusion of this transition, could we, the citizens, be certain that the resulting organization would continue to be accountable to maintaining a secure, safe, resilient internet free from capture of special interests. I'm not sure that it was really resolved in the hearing. It was interesting. But it was yet another example. This is the 8th or 9th one of these hearings in the last 2 months on this topic. And it's another example of a lot of information coming together at one time. And as you've heard from our panelists this morning, it could maybe best be described as organized and functional chaos at some level. When you listen to the questions that Susan just threw out around how the internet actually can impact things as fundamental as human rights or trade or sovereignty, the shift of populations on the internet from basically northwest to southeast, and that pivot point has basically been reached right about now. We're at the point where there are as many, if not more, Eastern participants on the internet, if you want to think about it that way, as there were historically sort of the Western EU, US, North America dominated. And that is having a fundamental impact. But I think that one of the things I didn't hear anybody bring up this morning was a way to think about being involved from an organizational strategy perspective. So you've each individually identified areas that you are personally interested in research and where clearly there's a gap. But I wonder if you would be willing to, each of you, take just maybe a moment to identify in your own mind how you think this kind of research could be best structured so that entities like Microsoft or Google or Facebook or other entrepreneurs can actually make use of it in terms of how we choose to drive our own business forward. One of the things that's true about Microsoft today, it's different from Microsoft of the past, is that we don't have anything to sell to anybody who is not connected. on the planet anymore. So everything is connected. We're all reliant on this infrastructure, not just Microsoft, but basically everyone. And I think Laura pointed out right at the beginning that this is essentially the entire global economy is wrapped up in the internet. So I was wondering if you could just go down the line and, 60 seconds or less, how should we in the private sector engage with you in the academic sector to basically enhance our own ability to make this whole thing better?
That's a really large question, and I've never answered anything in less than 60 seconds. But go. Right. The first thing I want to mention is that I am involved in a global commission on internet governance. I serve as the research director. It's a completely independent commission. It's chaired by Carl Bildt, the former Prime Minister of Sweden. It has about 28 people from all around the world and a set of about 25 researchers, and we're developing policy-engaged research that informs the debates. Now, that being said, I think it's essential to have more private sector input into that. My personal opinion is that having more connections in these various fora. I know Microsoft does a great job of going into the standard-setting organizations, being involved in the WSIS process, and with your role in internet governance, so you're definitely in the debates. But I think what needs to happen is to have more of a global focus, not speaking to Microsoft, but just to all of us. You could hear it in this room in our discussion. Even a team of researchers coming together that are interdisciplinary, they can't just be interdisciplinary. They have to be from different parts of the world. I think that that's part of it. So I would say that having interdisciplinary connections, having events just like this that bring people together is a pretty good start. And identifying very specific problems, taking it out of the realm of these concepts and into hard problems, and then assembling the people that are necessary to solve it.
Okay, let's go to the other end and go to Susan.
Okay, thanks. I've been thinking a lot about this since our dinner last night, and it seems to me that we need to change the incentives to both encourage people to share data more, but we also need to encourage the incentives to get people to respect data more. And when they share that data, to do so in ways that build and do not undermine trust. Now, I know that's very generic, what I just said to you, but I only have 60 seconds, and the how, I think, is not so easy. But again, there are too many data sets that are proprietary, and we need a greater understanding of how, let's say, data sets related to malware from one company relate to that of another company. So I'm saying FireEye and Kaspersky, if we could only get them to put their data forward, plus, let's say, the CERT data, we could do more comparative studies of whether or not malware use is increasing and the strength of the attacks, as example. Again, on the other side, I think we need greater respect for the privacy of people's data, and if companies such as Microsoft, which do respect that privacy, can push for norms of good corporate behavior in that regard, I think that'll be extraordinarily helpful. Sorry for the long-winded.
Well, first of all, I think companies like Microsoft are, at least it was to me, surprisingly well represented in nearly all the meetings that I went to when I was in the government. I mean, all the kind of public meetings, not the government's meetings inside government. But anyway, all these meetings I went to, there was always someone from Microsoft and always someone from Google. So I think the issue is really how to incorporate all the other stakeholders. I mean, this idea that industry is one stakeholder and civil society is another stakeholder and governments are another. I would push to kind of refine our understanding of what these stakeholders are. But certainly large multinational companies, I think, have much more influence on the process of internet governance than certainly academics or smaller entities. I don't know if that's the answer you were looking for, but.
That's good.
That's a great question. And so, how do companies approach this field of internet governance? First to kind of level set, 10 years ago at the dawn of internet governance discussions, or maybe even a little before that actually, internet governance was largely about ICANN as an institutional innovation and policies around internet names and numbers. And now it's become a much broader set of concerns about the ongoing sets of disputes and deliberations about the internet and the policies that affect it. But the overarching dilemma, still remains the same. It's this tension between sovereign states and their desire to set communications information policy through traditional mechanisms versus the transnational nature of the internet and its governance mechanisms. And we really shouldn't focus too much on ICANN or the regional internet registries. There's so much more interesting governance structures that are out there that are happening below the surface that we know very little about. So that's an area that I think companies need to pay attention to. More generally, I'd say in terms of kind of looking at internet governance, Carolyn mentioned 4 areas that a taxonomy of kind of how you would look at research in this area. And I have to admit, I kind of cringed because it seemed a little bit disciplinary focused. And for me, that doesn't necessarily lead us in the right direction of how we want to look at these issues. So I tend to look at internet governance as 4 buckets, right? And so we have an intellectual property rights bucket. And we talk about copyright and trademark and kind of this tension between the transnational information sharing versus setting up boundaries, technical and legal boundaries around trademark, around domain names and digital content. The second area would be content regulation. And so issues about, and these are really the tough ones, about censorship, about freedom of expression. So they touch on specific issues like spam. The third area would be security, and that's kind of a catch-all, ranging from issues like malware, data breach, intrusion, but also the tensions and relationships between internet security and national security, and also issues like data protection and data privacy. That falls in there. And then the final area that I would think about, if I was trying to organize a research agenda for a company, would be the critical internet resources and kind of the fundamental infrastructure of the internet, the DNS, internet routing, how we govern those resources, and also the issues like fragmentation. How do we confront this issue? So.
That's great. I was hoping you would give us that little taxonomy there, so without prompting. So here's an issue that is actually very current today. There was a working group within the ICANN community that was addressing the issue of privacy and proxy services. So those are where you can register a website, but you can hide your registration behind a privacy proxy entity. We know here from our work with digital crimes that a lot of malicious activity on the internet is hidden behind privacy proxy services, and that when we identify the activity, it's very difficult for us to get the actual data about the entity that is responsible for the website that's causing the problem. This working group at ICANN was split on the issue of whether in the future websites that engaged in commercial activities and financial transactions should be somehow prohibited from using these privacy proxy services. So the working group was split on this issue because, on the one hand, it's very difficult to identify what exactly is a commercial transaction. For example, if you're a blogger in Uzbekistan and you're taking donations on your website, and for a variety of reasons you might fear for your life if your data was public, that could be defined as commercial because it's a financial transaction, and you here, at least in the US, you would generally support the idea that this person should have a right to privacy for protection. On the other hand, there are numerous fake pharma vendors out there that are selling sugar pills as though they're something else for real money using credit cards, and you would perhaps think that those should be shut down. I'm just interested in the views of the panel here on, and we, by the way, as Microsoft is a member of the business community, we have to weigh in on this particular issue. There's a large online discussion going on right now today because we will file a comment on this very issue by noon, actually in 16 minutes. And so I'm interested in your take on two things. First of all, the issue itself, but more importantly, how within this organized chaos that the internet is, how should an issue like this actually be resolved?
I will answer that really quickly. The ability to have anonymous speech has been fundamental to democracy, so it's very important to acknowledge that. But how does that translate into the online world is the question. I would break it down into two requirements. I think anyone should have a right to register a website and not have any member of the public just look it up like a whois lookup kind of situation and know the person's address, where they live. That seems like a fundamental right to be able to not have that publicly available. Without that, there wouldn't be the kind of speech that we have today. But there also has to be traceable anonymity so that law enforcement can get a record of something if it's necessary. So I think that there shouldn't be there should be that requirement to have traceable anonymity so that you could go to the registrar and find that record out. And that would have to be done based on a national law, rule of law based on the country that someone is in, so that you could find out in law enforcement situations.
Anyone else?
Just one thing that concerns me about this discussion is it's often put in terms of specific human rights, such as privacy rights, versus, the needs of governments to find people. And I think often governments do not share due process concepts. And so it very much concerns me that we're having this debate in the absence of any sort of shared norms regarding due process. So that's what I want to say.
Great.
Well, I don't think in the 15 minutes that are left, I'm going to make suggestions for how Microsoft should change its comments. I will say, though, that I'm quite skeptical of the way that law enforcement equities is the buzzword that I learned in the State Department, are kind of dominating these discussions, and how policy about things like takedowns and other things that are in this umbrella that you mentioned is really getting made outside of the public discourse. It's, particular law enforcement agents going to particular judges and getting court orders to do things that in many cases I suspect the judges don't fully understand. And I think that's not the right way to make policy. And one of the things that I advocated for when I was at the State Department is the idea that governments should refrain from attacking that's the inflammatory way to say it, but attacking the core infrastructures of the internet. So I'm very skeptical about using things like the DNS and routing tables as a way to fight cybercrime. And then, of course, the question is what comes next? Like, what's your answer? No, I don't have a full answer, except generally, I think that we should push as much of this out to the edge as we can and take it out of the fighting over the DNS, for example, and push them up through the abstraction layers. Because otherwise, once other governments figure out how to do what our government's doing, it's going to be more of a food fight than it is already.
All right, Brendan, did you want to add a comment? Great. So at this point, what I'd like to do, because we have 15 minutes left, is really to open up the conversation and see and hear from you in terms of, based on the issues that you've heard and the opinions from our distinguished panelists, what are some of the questions that you have on this issue? Yes, please.
All right, hello, thanks. So I just had a question about
May I ask you to introduce yourself first?
Sorry. My name is Brendan O'Connor at University of Massachusetts, Amherst. So I was wondering about the foundational issues for maybe the institutional economic point of view. Are the incentives there for nation states to cooperate on internet governance far into the future? So for example, 20% of the world lives in a place where they can't access the full internet, and internet governance has not been able to achieve kind of a full free internet. And so that's if you live in China, of course. And Chinese government has decided it's better to run a different form of the internet that debatably is somewhat separate from the rest of the world internet. And proposing more standards isn't going to change their incentive structure or preferences to switch to that. And you could imagine that, maybe other countries might decide they would prefer a form of the internet that's more like China's than like the US, EU, lots of acronyms model. And so, maybe even if nation-state incentives are just really against this form of internet governance, it has the same challenges that other forms of international cooperation have, like, climate change treaties or peacekeeping operations and things like that. So I was wondering if anyone has comments about what does the future look like, especially with more distributed, power at the geopolitical level, for example.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. Who would like to comment? Susan?
I would love to comment, and thank you so much for your question. I'm actually very optimistic about this for two reasons. Because there are more and more studies showing the economic benefits of an open internet to everything from human rights to good governance to, and I think increasingly, not just citizens are advocates of an open internet, but firms. So I am optimistic even in places like China. The other thing is that that's one of the reasons that I see government, the US government, moving to government-dominated venues, which could be dangerous because, again, you want people in business to be these advocates. But, in the trade regime, this is the positive side of it, there are potentials to challenge nations for censorship, for internet restrictive practices in a way that builds on access to information and due process rights, because those are embedded in trade agreements. So I think there are growing incentives that more and more people are aware of, and that you can see this in venues. On the other hand, one could argue that more and more governments are forming their own intranets, and it is a scare, what's happening in Russia, for example. So I'll let other people comment. Excuse my ambivalence there, but I am more optimistic than pessimistic.
Susan, I hope you're right. I think this question of fragmentation and data localization and all the issues that go with that is one of these issues that we kind of just say that's bad. And I think a little bit of thought and investigation could be put into asking the question, what would the internet look like if it went that direction? And some of you know I'm a proponent of biology as the answer to all questions in computer science. And in biology, we certainly have a lot of diverse ecosystems and diverse species within ecosystems and diverse individuals within species. And so I don't know that it would be bad to have a world like the one that you're outlining. But I think we need to ask that question, think what the consequences would be. Have your own microphone, sorry.
Yeah, it's a great question. And picking up on Susan's points, I think that states do recognize kind of the economic benefits of a unfragmented internet, an unfragmented DNS, and unfragmented routing system. And they're tacitly, if not explicitly, endorsing multi-stakeholder governance around critical internet resources. I mean, we even see China last week at NetMundial kind of openly supporting the multi-stakeholder model. That being said, they're doing very, the types of things that a lot of people would not like to see them do at the domestic level. So what I think we need to really pay attention to going forward is what happens to the role of governments in multi-stakeholder governance organizations. So we need to really kind of unpack, they're not just monolithic governments, as Stephanie was saying. They have a variety of interests. Sometimes they conflict. And we need to actually have those agencies, government agencies, participating in these governance organizations and expressing what those interests are, so we can have, so we have a greater understanding of where we need to adapt policy to meet those needs.
Great. Nora?
Just really quickly, thank you. You could argue that we don't have a universal internet now because of language barriers, because of access barriers, because of access speeds, because of filtering and censoring systems, and the fact that we see different information in different places. But at a technical level, there has been the building blocks of universality for the internet, and I think that that is really key. And I'll assert that the cost of fragmentation is real, whether you're talking at the protocol level, the institutional level, or at the level of private companies. What's often left out of this discussion is that the largest users of the internet are private industry, large companies like the financial services sector, transportation, energy, and they are doing business globally. And I know McKinsey is right now in the middle of a study. They've done the qualitative part and they're working on the quantitative part of the cost of data localization measures and different country-specific requirements on the financial services industry. So I think that those kinds of governance decisions that are primarily geopolitically motivated have very profound economic implications, not just for the cost of private industry doing business, but also for the potential for permissionless innovation that has given us the internet that we have today.
Great, thank you. And I'll just add my 2 cents on top of that, which is the panelists have talked about both the benefits, the economic benefits, as well as the cost of some of the issues, such as the fragmentation. I'd like to put an appeal out there that we absolutely need evidence on what this means. Because a lot of the, in a policy conversation, these things get thrown around, and there aren't very hard evidence actually looking at quantifying what are the benefits, what are the evidence, really formal, rigorous methods, as well as what is the cost of the fragmentations. Let's have that evidence on the table to enable more informed policy discussion. That's a little bit of what this conversation is all about. Another question? Yeah. If not, what I'd like to do is to ask a question to all the panelists, but then also ask for your closing comment. And what I'd like to do is kind of go back. Being that this is a research conversation, and you're all fantastic researchers, what if we were to start the IG public discussion, policy discussion fresh? How would you frame the discussion in a way that maybe enables more rational approaches? And also, who should be at the table? What would be a holistic framework to guide this discussion? There's this, Paul keeps on mentioning organized chaos. Is there a better holistic framework to look at this?
I would say that a better framing would be one that does not adopt one of the extremes that we've seen over the last 20 years. On one extreme, we have a community that says these are just technical decisions and that they have no political implications. On the other hand, we have policymakers making it all about the geopolitical implications. And of course, the truth is always somewhere in between. So I think acknowledging that the stability and the security of the infrastructure itself, material and virtual, is absolutely one of the greatest public policy problems of our time, keeping that operational. I would say that that's the framing that I would use. And I would kind of expand on that framing by saying that we have to acknowledge a very important fact about the internet. And the very important fact about the internet is that it's no longer a communication network. We still think about it like that, as content, communications between people. But think about the last session that we were in with cyber objects. Now more objects are connected to the internet than people on the planet. And if all of us were taken off the planet now, the internet would continue to exchange information. Isn't that interesting? Surveillance videos, at least for a time, it would keep flowing for a while. And we have to think about the fact that it's an autonomous system in some ways, and it's a control system as well as a communication system. Think about the Supreme Court ruling, quoting Chief Justice Roberts in the cell phone ruling in 2014, where he said if the proverbial Martian landed on the Earth today, it would assume that a cell phone was part of our anatomy, right? So we have to think about it integrated not only into the Internet of Things, but also in a way, our biology.
Thank you, Laura. Brendan?
Well, so I mentioned earlier kind of my way of thinking about what internet governance issues are, or what buckets they fall into. So I guess I would, I want to advocate for what I think will accomplish push forward the internet governance dialogue. And for me, that's closer engagement of kind of political economy, institutions, and computer science research. And to do that and to do it well is going to take a lot of effort, from data to institutional support from companies like Microsoft and the academic world too. But there's some really important things that we need to learn about. We can focus all we want on ICANN and its structures, and we do need to pay attention to it, but these kind of underlying networked forms of governance that occur all over the internet, we know very little about. We don't know much about it from an economic perspective, the supply and demand of why we have these different forms of network governance. We don't know much about the economic characteristics of it. So for instance, like routing registries are used increasingly, but we know very little about how they actually operate. We don't know if they have public good characteristics or if they have other characteristics. We don't know if there are network externalities associated with their use. So there are a lot of interesting areas that really are only going to be, we're going to only have greater insights if we do multidisciplinary research.
Thank you.
So if we were going to start the discussion from scratch, I guess the two things I would say is, first of all, I might not use the word governance, because I think that that has already kind of politicized the discussion. And what a better word would be, I don't know, I've heard some alternatives, but I think that kind of slants the discussion of the problem. And kind of following up on what Laura said, which I completely agree with, I think we need some way to realize that the kind of the timescales of political policy decision making and the timescales of engineering decision making, they're very quite different. And so one of the frustrations I see is trying to put those two things together when the way the processes run are just at completely different speeds. So that's one thing. And then the only other comment I would make is, I think if the public, the average citizen who we speak to every night when we go home or on the bus, had been involved and really engaged in the importance of these discussions much earlier, it would be a different discussion. And as it is, the average person on the street didn't realize that any of this mattered, I think, until after the Snowden revelations started coming out. And so that's another thing where if we'd had real public engagement, and if we even today had real public increased engagement, I think it would be a different conversation.
Well, two things, and I'm going to go first to the normative. So the internet is supposedly built to facilitate trust, and it seems like it did do just that, right? Because one user and one producer of information don't know each other in general. But it seems like these days more and more the internet is leading to greater distrust among human beings. And that is for many reasons, right? And but so I hope that the central norm that we use to think about it is, how can we facilitate trust among users and producers of information? The second point I want to make, is particularly to Americans, is that many governments provide public goods online. And so whether it's an election, as in Brazil, or it's healthcare services or education, we need to understand that some governments look at these issues and their citizens as matters of information security, not because they don't want to share information, but because they are providing services to their people, and they feel that must be done in a way that protects the security of that information. So my long-winded point there is that we need more tolerance of different governance cultures to really achieve good governance online.
Thank you, Susan, for raising those issues. What I'll do is I'll ask Paul to give the closing remark.
So thanks. And thanks to all of you for coming and spending some time here. You've each provided some great examples of places where there's more research needed. I'm particularly struck by Susan's suggestion of the delta between norms and process, sort of norms and rule of law, and how that impacts the way that the internet ends up being used and trust amongst countries and amongst citizens. That's one example. Brendan listed 4 separate categories where research and additional engagement is necessary. We heard about the economic impact, and we've certainly at Microsoft used the World Bank stats on an X% improvement of broadband equals a Y% improvement in GDP. Those get kind of old after a while. I think there is a lot that could be done that's really more focused on what the impacts are when you start from zero, because there's a whole part of the world that is not connected, and that looks like a great new research opportunity for starting from zero and bringing populations online. These are also populations, for the most part, that don't speak English or don't use Latin character sets, and this is another area we didn't really touch on, but the overall internationalization of the internet is a process that is, at this point, is a work in progress, and it's moving, but it's not moving as fast as many people would like. I think there's opportunities to engage there for people who are particularly interested in the emerging new parts of what will be the internet economy. And then the other thing that I think you've each individually sort of touched on in some way is the pressures that are occurring when divergent cultures are pushed together a little more quickly and a little more closely than might naturally have occurred. In the time when I was growing up, we didn't have the internet, and we used stone tablets to do term papers, things like that. The ability to get an idea to many people, it was pretty hard. You couldn't do that. Today, anyone in this room in 5 minutes can get an idea across the world to, somewhere towards 3 billion people if you work really hard at it. And that has a tremendous sociological implication, but it also has a tremendous technical implication for the people who are building the services and infrastructures that enable that. I think there's real opportunity to do some work there on just what the long-term, projected impacts of that kind of accelerated cross-cultural pollination could be, as well as, and there's 2 sides of that. There's the good side, which is how you can elevate societies, but there's the flip side, which is how rapidly you can spread destructive material, destructive ideas, and tear things down at the same time. So those are great opportunities. I hope that all of you here might have taken away something that will spur an idea that maybe you'd like to pursue as well. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks for taking your time.
And thank you to all of our panelists.